Most believers were never taught to question their biggest financial decisions through Scripture. They were taught to work hard, save faithfully, and assume that buying a house was the ultimate proof of maturity and blessing. Yet many Christians quietly feel trapped, overworked, and financially anxious, wondering why obedience didn't bring the peace they expected. The tension isn't a lack of faith, it's a lack of biblical financial understanding. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of the most celebrated financial goals in Christian culture were never commanded by God. They were inherited from society, reinforced by tradition, and baptized with spiritual language. Meanwhile, Scripture paints a very different picture of how money, provision, and wisdom actually work. What if the pressure you feel isn't God pushing you forward, but culture pulling you into a system that benefits everyone except you? This matters because housing is not just a financial decision, it's a spiritual one. The way you handle money shapes your freedom, your generosity, your calling, and even your peace. Many believers buy too early, stretch too far, and silence opportunities God places in front of them, all in the name of doing the right thing. But biblical wisdom doesn't reward appearance, it rewards alignment. In this message, we're going to dismantle the myths surrounding homeownership in 2026 and look honestly at what the Bible actually says about wealth, stewardship, and timing. Not opinions, not trends, Scripture. You'll discover why God prioritizes fruitfulness over stability, multiplication over maintenance, and wisdom over emotional decisions. This isn't about fear, it's about clarity. If you like our content, consider supporting our ministry through the link in the description. By the end, you won't just think differently about buying or renting a house, you'll understand how to structure your money so it serves your calling instead of controlling your life, and how to make financial decisions that bring peace instead of pressure. The hidden belief about home ownership. Most Christians never question. Most believers never realize that their ideas about money and success were shaped long before they ever opened a Bible. They grew up hearing that stability equals blessing, that owning a house is proof they finally made it. In churches, this belief often goes unchallenged, wrapped in respectability and good intentions. Yet this mindset quietly trains people to work harder, save longer, and delay purpose, all while assuming God's favor looks like a mortgage paid on time. What feels spiritual is often just cultural tradition with a Christian label. Scripture never presents a house as the ultimate reward of obedience or faithfulness. Abraham lived in tents while being unimaginably wealthy because his trust wasn't in land deeds, but in God's promises. Hebrews 11:9 reminds us that he lived as a stranger in the land of promise, yet lacked nothing. That alone should make any believer pause before assuming home ownership is the finish line of prosperity. The Bible consistently separates security in God from security in property. The hidden belief is subtle but powerful. Once I own a home, then I'll be safe. That belief drives countless financial decisions, from career choices to delaying a calling or avoiding business risks. People stay stuck in jobs they hate, not because God told them to, but because the house payment demands it. Money becomes a master instead of a servant, and the goal quietly shifts from fruitfulness to survival. Jesus warned about this tension when he said, "No one can serve two masters." From a financial perspective, this belief also shapes how people try to make money. Instead of building assets that generate income, many Christians pour everything into a single liability and call it wisdom. Proverbs 24:3 says, "By wisdom a house is built, and through understanding it is established. But wisdom comes before the house, not after." Wisdom multiplies resources. It doesn't just lock them into walls. The house was never meant to replace discernment. A practical example makes this clear. Two families earn the same income, but one focuses only on buying a home as fast as possible, while the other first builds skills, small business ownership, and income streams. One family looks stable but feels pressure every month. The other feels flexible, mobile, and at peace. Both love God, both pray, but only one aligned their money decisions with biblical principles of stewardship and growth. The difference isn't faith, it's understanding. This is why the question isn't simply whether buying a house is right or wrong. The deeper issue is whether believers have confused cultural milestones with God's design for provision. Until that belief is exposed, every financial decision will be filtered through fear instead of wisdom. And once that belief is challenged, a much bigger question naturally opens up. If a house isn't the finish line, what does the Bible actually define as true prosperity? Why the Bible never treats a house as the finish line of prosperity? Throughout Scripture, prosperity is never measured by square footage or property lines. God consistently defines blessing in terms of purpose, provision, and fruitfulness, not ownership of physical structures. King David lived in a palace, yet openly acknowledged that his security came from the Lord, not from walls or wealth. Psalm 127:1 makes this unmistakably clear. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. The verse isn't about construction, it's about source and priority. The Bible repeatedly shows that houses follow obedience, not the other way around. In Deuteronomy 8, God warns Israel not to confuse the comfort of houses full of good things with the power that actually produced them. That warning still applies today. When believers make housing the ultimate goal, money slowly shifts from a tool for stewardship into a trophy of arrival. Prosperity becomes something to display instead of something to multiply. From a financial perspective, Scripture favors movement over permanence. The early church met in homes, rented spaces, and public areas, yet it expanded faster than any institution in history. Their resources flowed into people, mission, and impact, not into preserving assets that didn't generate return. This mirrors how wealth actually grows in modern business as well. Capital that stays flexible can make money. Capital locked into status symbols usually cannot. Jesus' own lifestyle reinforces this principle. He said plainly in Matthew 8:20 that the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. That wasn't poverty, it was intentional freedom. His mission required mobility, responsiveness, and detachment from possessions that could slow him down. The lesson for believers today isn't to avoid owning a house, but to avoid letting ownership dictate obedience or financial decisions. Practically, this is why many financially strained families look successful on the outside. They achieved the milestone they were told mattered most, but now every decision revolves around maintaining it. Business opportunities get ignored, investments feel too risky, and callings are postponed indefinitely. Meanwhile, those who delayed the house to build income-producing assets often find that prosperity eventually pays for shelter with ease. When believers realize that Scripture never crowns a house as the end goal, a shift begins to happen. Housing becomes a strategic choice, not a spiritual destination. Money starts serving calling instead of controlling it. And that realization naturally raises the next, more uncomfortable question. When does a house stop being a blessing and quietly become a financial burden disguised as success? Asset or idol? When a house becomes a financial trap instead of a blessing. The Bible is clear that blessings can quietly turn into idols when they begin to control decisions, emotions, and obedience. A house becomes dangerous not because it exists, but because it starts demanding loyalty. When most of someone's money goes toward preserving one asset, fear replaces faith. Choices are no longer guided by wisdom, prayer, or opportunity, but by the monthly obligation that must be fed. That is how a blessing slowly becomes a burden. Jesus warned about this principle in Luke 12:15 when he said to, "Watch out for all kinds of greed." Greed is not only the desire for more, but the inability to let go. A house becomes an idol when someone cannot pivot, relocate, invest, or obey God because of it. At that point, ownership owns the person. What was meant to provide shelter begins to silently restrict calling, generosity, and growth. Financially, this trap shows up when people confuse appreciation with productivity. A house may increase in price, but it rarely produces income. It consumes money through taxes, repairs, insurance, and interest while giving nothing back monthly. From a business standpoint, that's the definition of a liability. Proverbs 22:7 reminds us that the borrower is servant to the lender, and few debts enslave emotions and options like a mortgage. A practical example reveals the contrast. One believer locks most of their capital into a house and feels proud of stability, yet hesitates every time an opportunity to make money appears. Another keeps housing flexible, rents modestly, and channels resources into income-producing assets. One feels accomplished but stuck. The other feels unfinished but free. Both pray, but only one structured their money to respond quickly when opportunity knocks. Scripture consistently praises stewardship over possession. In the parable of the talents, the servants weren't rewarded for storing resources safely, but for multiplying them. The servant who protected what he had without growth was corrected, not praised. God's concern wasn't preservation, it was productivity. When a house prevents multiplication, it is no longer aligned with biblical stewardship. This is why discernment matters more than tradition. A house can absolutely be a blessing, but only when it serves the larger purpose of provision and impact. Once believers recognize this line, a deeper question emerges naturally. If ownership alone isn't the goal, what does Scripture actually teach about how money should be managed, multiplied, and stewarded responsibly? The biblical difference between ownership and stewardship of money. One of the most misunderstood financial concepts in Scripture is the difference between ownership and stewardship. The Bible never presents humans as true owners of anything. It consistently frames them as managers. Psalm 24:1 settles this debate clearly. The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it. That single verse reframes how believers should view money, assets, business, and even a house. Nothing truly belongs to us. Everything is entrusted to us. Ownership mentality says this is mine and it exists for my security. Stewardship mentality says this is God's and I'm responsible for how it multiplies. That shift changes how decisions are made. A steward doesn't ask what makes me look successful, but what produces fruit. This is why many Christians struggle financially despite good intentions. They protect what they have instead of positioning it to grow. Jesus reinforced this mindset repeatedly through his teachings. In Luke 16:10-11, he explains that faithfulness in small financial matters qualifies someone for greater responsibility. Notice that he doesn't say faithfulness leads to comfort. It leads to trust. God entrusts more money and influence to those who manage well, not to those who merely accumulate. Stewardship is always tested before expansion. From a practical financial angle, stewardship changes how people make money. Instead of pouring all resources into one asset, wise stewards diversify. They invest in skills, small businesses, equities, and income streams that serve long-term purpose. Ecclesiastes 11:2 advises, invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8, recognizing uncertainty and encouraging distribution. That is biblical risk management, not fear-based hoarding. A real-world example makes this visible. 2 believers earn the same income, but one treats their house as the centerpiece of their financial life, while the other treats it as one tool among many. The steward builds reserves, learns business systems, and allocates capital to assets that generate cash flow. Over time, one feels squeezed while the other experiences margin. Same faith, different framework. Once believers grasp stewardship, guilt around money begins to fade. Wealth stops being about possession and starts being about responsibility. The question is no longer, can I afford this? But, does this align with multiplication? And that naturally leads into the next issue Scripture emphasizes: why God consistently blesses growth, increase, and cash flow rather than mere financial stability. Why God blesses cash flow and multiplication, not just stability. Throughout the Bible, God consistently rewards movement, growth, and increase, never stagnation disguised as safety. Stability may feel comforting, but Scripture rarely celebrates comfort as a destination. In Genesis 1:28, the very first financial and economic mandate given to humanity was to be fruitful and multiply. That command was not spiritualized away. It included work, resources, expansion, and provision. God's design has always involved increase with purpose. Cash flow is simply the modern language for biblical multiplication. When money moves, produces, and reproduces, it mirrors the principle of seed time and harvest found in Galatians 6:7. Seeds stored in a barn feel safe, but they produce nothing. Seeds planted carry risk, but they create future provision. This is why God often blesses those willing to release resources into productive use, instead of locking them away for emotional security. Jesus emphasized this principle in the parable of the talents. The servants who multiplied what they were given were called good and faithful, while the one who preserved money without growth was rebuked. Notice the issue was not loss, but lack of increase. From a business perspective, God applauds return on investment, not inactivity. Money that makes money is aligned with biblical stewardship. In practical terms, this is why many believers remain financially stressed despite owning assets. A house that consumes income may feel stable, but it doesn't generate provision. On the other hand, a small business dividend-paying stocks or scalable skills can create consistent cash flow. Assets that produce income allow believers to give, save, invest, and live with margin. Stability alone rarely does that. A simple example makes this clear. One person works hard, saves diligently, and pours everything into maintaining a lifestyle. Another uses excess money to build income streams that operate even when they rest. Over time, one remains dependent on effort while the other gains leverage. Proverbs 13:22 reminds us that a good person leaves an inheritance, which requires surplus, not just survival. When believers understand that God blesses multiplication more than maintenance, financial decisions begin to change. Money becomes a tool for expansion, not a shield against fear. That shift naturally raises an important question for this season. If growth is the goal, how should a wise believer think about buying or renting a house in 2026 without violating biblical wisdom or financial discernment? Buy or rent in 2026. How wise believers think in seasons, not emotions. Wise believers understand that the Bible never commands a single financial move for every season of life. Scripture teaches discernment, timing, and obedience, not emotional decision-making. Ecclesiastes 3:1 reminds us that there is a time for everything, including major money decisions like buying or renting a house. The problem is not renting or buying. The problem is making permanent commitments based on temporary emotions. Wisdom looks at season before status. In seasons of building, flexibility often produces greater fruit than ownership. Renting can preserve capital, reduce risk, and allow believers to respond quickly to business opportunities. Many people feel pressure to buy because it looks responsible. Yet Proverbs 14:8 teaches that the wisdom of the prudent is to give thought to their ways. Thoughtful planning often favors liquidity over pride. Cash on hand creates options. Locked equity often removes them. Emotion-driven decisions usually come from fear or comparison. Seeing others buy homes can trigger urgency, even when finances or calling are not aligned. Jesus warned in Luke 14:28 to count the cost before building, emphasizing calculation over impulse. Buying too early can suffocate growth, while renting strategically can accelerate it. Money decisions made in peace usually outperform those made in panic. From a financial standpoint, renting is not throwing money away when it funds future expansion. A business owner who rents modestly while reinvesting capital into assets that make money often builds wealth faster. That same person can later buy a house outright or on better terms. Renting becomes a temporary strategy, not a permanent identity. Season-aware believers treat housing as a tool, not a verdict. A practical example helps clarify this mindset. One believer buys early, stretching every dollar to qualify, while another rents and channels surplus into skills, investments, and business growth. Years later, the second believer controls assets that pay for housing effortlessly. The difference wasn't income, it was timing. Wisdom delayed consumption to accelerate provision. This is why Scripture rewards patience paired with action. Hebrews 6:12 encourages believers to inherit promises through faith and patience, not haste. When housing decisions align with season, money flows with less resistance. And once timing is understood, the final question becomes unavoidable. If buying isn't always the first move, what kind of assets should come before the house to secure long-term freedom and provision? The wealth pattern, hidden in Scripture that pays for your life before your lifestyle. Scripture reveals a consistent wealth pattern that most people overlook because it contradicts modern financial habits. The Bible never teaches believers to upgrade lifestyle first and figure out provision later. Instead, it shows provision preceding comfort. In Genesis 41, Joseph didn't build palaces during the years of plenty. He built systems, storage, and structure. His wealth strategy paid for survival before luxury ever entered the picture. This pattern appears again in Proverbs 21:5, which says that the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance. Abundance follows planning, not impulse. In today's terms, this means building assets that make money before committing to long-term expenses. Lifestyle should be funded by systems, not by stress. When income pays for living costs automatically, peace replaces pressure. From a business perspective, wealthy individuals prioritize income engines over image. They invest first in things that produce cash flow, businesses, scalable skills, partnerships, and ownership stakes. These assets quietly work in the background while life moves forward. Money earned this way feels different because it isn't consumed by survival. It creates margin, generosity, and choice. A practical illustration brings this home. One person uses their savings to increase lifestyle, while another uses the same amount to acquire or build an income-producing asset. Over time, the second person's asset pays for rent, food, and eventually a home. The first person depends entirely on continued labor. The Bible consistently affirms the second path because it aligns with stewardship and multiplication. Jesus subtly reinforced this principle when he taught about counting the cost and building a foundation before constructing a tower. Foundation always comes first. In financial terms, income-producing assets are the foundation, while housing and lifestyle are the structure. When the order is reversed, collapse becomes likely. When the order is respected, growth becomes sustainable. Once this biblical pattern is understood, the entire conversation about housing changes. Buying or renting stops being a debate and becomes a strategic decision. Money starts working before life demands more of it. And with that understanding in place, the stage is set to frame the entire message from the beginning, connecting pain, truth, and solution in a way that speaks directly to the heart. Now the responsibility shifts to you. Knowledge without application never produces fruit. The Bible is clear that wisdom only works when it's acted upon. James 1:22 reminds believers not to be hearers only, but doers. Everything you've learned here points to one truth. Your financial future will not be shaped by tradition, pressure, or appearances, but by the decisions you make with clarity and courage. Ask yourself honestly, are your current money decisions giving you more peace or more pressure? Are they creating freedom to obey God or quietly limiting your options? Too many believers delay their calling because their finances are built on obligations instead of opportunity. But it doesn't have to stay that way. You can restructure, you can realign, you can choose wisdom over urgency. This is not about rejecting houses, comfort, or stability. It's about putting things in the right order. Assets before lifestyle, income before expense, stewardship before status. When your money works for you instead of against you, generosity becomes natural and obedience becomes easier. That's how biblical prosperity was always meant to function. Write in the comments, "My money serves God's purpose," and watch how this powerful declaration begins to shift the course of your business and your finances from this day forward. If this message touched you in any way, don't ignore that conviction. Take time to review your finances, question assumptions, and apply what you've learned with courage. If this message blessed you, consider supporting our ministry through the link in the description. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can continue learning how faith, business, and making money were designed to work together.